Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Welcome. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I would like to thank you for joining today's ADHD Experts presentation on IEPs and 504 plans for students with ADHD and learning challenges. How to choose your path, what to do when you encounter obstacles in your path, and how to know if a detour is warranted. IEPs and 504 plans are designed to meet students' learning needs and power their success in school from elementary through high school. They can be powerful tools. However, securing and maintaining an IEP or 504 plan can be confusing and a time-consuming process. For a number of reasons, it's not always smooth sailing after a student is approved for accommodations and services. Sometimes the schools fail to follow through on a student's plans. Other times the plan just doesn't work or the student's needs change with age and circumstance. In this webinar, we will start with an overview of IEPs and 504 plans, and then look at how to troubleshoot common issues that parents encounter with these programs. Leading today's presentation is Susan Yellin. Susan is the Director of Advocacy and Transition Services at the Yellin Center for Mind, Brain, and Education, an innovative learning support and diagnostic practice in New York City. She co-authored the award-winning book, Life After High School, a guide for students with disabilities and their families. And she was the founding director of the Center for Learning Differences, a nonprofit dedicated to helping families dealing with learning and attention difficulties find resources in their communities. If you subscribe to Attitude Magazine, I encourage you to read Susan's excellent article in our spring issue titled 9 Ways IEPs Fall Apart. It's on page 53, and it's a helpful complement to today's webinar. And if you're not a subscriber, I encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up to receive our quarterly magazine for caregivers, educators, adults, and professionals in the world of ADHD. Before I hand over the microphone to Susan, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into the live webinar may download the slides now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you are interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for the instructions in an email that you will receive about an hour after the live broadcast. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 391 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the Certificate of Attendance option. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Brain Balance. Brain Balance is a holistic cognitive development program designed to help kids, teens, and adults with ADHD, learning differences, anxiety, and beyond improve focus, attention, and behavior. Brain Balance creates a customized plan based on your child's needs to support their social, emotional, and academic growth. An exploratory study with Harvard's McLean Hospital found the Brain Balance program to be as effective as low-dose stimulant medication in alleviating ADHD symptoms in children. Visit brainbalance.com to learn about Brain Balance today. Attitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without any further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Susan Yellin. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this really essential discussion on IEPs and 504 plans.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. We're really dealing with simple subjects that have complicated aspects. Everybody who's listening to this program probably has encountered the terminology, a 504 plan or an IEP. But if we start at the beginning, we look at how these laws developed, how they're applied, and how they can help your child and how you can make them work best for your child, I think we can get something out of this hour. So let's begin. First of all, understand that both Section 504 and the IEPs, and we'll talk about the longer names of both of these laws, stem from federal laws. They are applied in every state, although there are some nuances that are different from state to state. But they help children not just with learning or attention, they can help children with medical issues. They apply fairly broadly, but because they have different origins and they're intended to do different things, there are real differences that parents need to understand. And if you understand them better, you as a parent can seek the best path for your child, possibly switch between them, and get the right way to help your child move ahead given her specific difficulties. I'm going to bear with me as I figure out how to move these slides. Okay, let's start looking a little bit more deeply at Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Hopefully that's the last time you hear that long title. Nobody calls it that. Everybody refers to Section 504. Section 504 doesn't just apply to K-12 students, but applies to students in college. There's a section of the law that applies in the workplace. But we are now looking specifically at the portion of the law that applies to students in the K-12 years. It is a law that relates to the funding of the federal government. So if it only applies where federal funding exists. So it applies to public schools. All states take federal money, therefore all the schools within the states are funded in part by federal money. Section 504 requires that public schools provide their students with a free, meaning publicly funded, public education. And that terminology is something that we call FAPE, F-A-P-E. You'll see that when we talk about the IDEA and the IEP, and I'll help with that alphabet soup in a minute for those who aren't familiar with them. But Section 504 requires that public schools provide a free, appropriate public education to every student whose physical or mental disability substantially limits one or more major life activities. Now, if you look at the statute and you read it, a physical or mental disability can go on for paragraphs. And it includes everything from concentrating to hearing to seeing to learning. It's extensive. And substantially limits is also a terminology that's been dealt with in the courts, but it's important to simply understand that the major life activities of school, of learning, of focusing are impacted by these disabilities, and it's a very, very broad set of terms. One thing you should be aware of, as we're just introducing the term FAPE, or Free Appropriate Public Education, for the first time, it's a term that's been defined by the United States Supreme Court, but basically what it means, it's not perfect education. Appropriate is the key word here, and appropriate simply means, a lawyer friend of mine just said, well, if it were a car, it would have four wheels and a motor and it would run. It's not ideal. And of course, what every parent wants is the ideal education for his or her child. So Section 504 requires public schools or private schools that take federal funding. So you could have a federal lunch program in a private school, for example. But basically, it applies only to public schools, and it requires that they provide a free, appropriate public education to each student who has a disability that limits their learning or attention. The other law that we're talking about is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which provides students with an IEP. IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. And it's created when students qualify for services under the IDEA. As I said, there's lots of alphabet soup, and I apologize, but that's how the system is set up. Unlike Section 504, which applies to those, with disabilities in a very broad definition, only students who fall within a list of classifications, there are 13 of them, including the classification of other health impaired, which is a catch-all that includes ADHD. The IDEA and the IEPs under it apply to all students, whether in public or private school. It has nothing to do with federal funding. A student in private school won't get an IEP. They'll get an IESP, an individualized educational services plan. Don't ask. But it applies to all students, whether they're in public or private school. The services tend to be stronger in a public school because for the private school students, the public district sends people into the private school to conduct the services. Let's say a student is getting speech and language services. In a public school, there'll be a speech and language teacher present. In a private school, it might be an itinerant speech and language teacher that the district sends into the several private schools in the district, and that will possibly give slightly less time with the teacher. The IEP comes to an end with high school graduation or at the end of a student's 21st year, so when on the student's 22nd birthday. Like the Section 504 plan, it requires a free, appropriate public education and also requires schools to actively seek out students who need services, something called child find. So, for example, if a teacher observes that a student in her class who has no services under any law is struggling, may have a reading disability, it's up to the school, she reports it to the school, it's up to the school to advise the parents that they believe the child has a disability and they'd like to start the process of looking into that further. Parents first are faced with the question of which of these two laws is best for their child. And there's a kind of a decision path to go down that helps with that process. The first thing to do is to consider whether your child's difficulties are primarily due to attention and whether he's doing generally well with things like reading and writing and math. For this student, a 504 plan, which provides accommodations, and we'll talk more about accommodations and what they can include later, but we're talking now about simple things like extended time on tests, maybe a quiet testing location, and some classroom strategies to help with focus might be sufficient. But if your child has substantial difficulties with learning or behavior, something like a reading challenge or a math problem, or even a behavioral aspect that requires some significant support, or maybe modifying the curriculum or a specialized classroom setting, maybe a smaller class, then he will likely require what we call the richer support of an IEP. So, who decides on which to pursue? It's the parent initially. You as the parents decide, and maybe you've spoken to the school and maybe you do this on your own. You decide whether you wish to pursue a Section 504 plan or an IEP under the IDEA. What's your first step? You ask in writing for the school to start the process of arranging an IEP or a 504 plan. It might be a letter to the principal. It might be that you fill out a form consenting that the school evaluate your child. Because the process for either of these two different paths starts with the school conducting an evaluation of your child to see what kinds of services or supports he needs. If you've had a private evaluation done, I work in a private evaluation center, so I'm very familiar with those. Not every parent is, but you can go to a private neuropsychologist or psychologist or a local college that's training students and get a private evaluation done. The school district will evaluate your child for free. Very important, and usually they're just fine, and it's a good place to start. Sometimes for a 504 plan, now the practice differs from city to city, district to district, state to state. Here in New York, for example, for a simple 504 plan, schools will accept a note from the child's doctor with a diagnosis of ADHD and an explanation of what the child needs because of this diagnosis. It's generally done in a 2-page form. The evaluation process for an IEP is far more structured and more extensive. But again, that's one of those things that differs from place to place. After this evaluation, the school will hold a meeting, either a 504 team meeting or a 504 meeting or an IEP meeting. The rules for an IEP meeting are very explicit. The first step of that is, does this child fall within one of these 13 classifications that the IEP provides? And then you move on from there. The 504 meetings are generally a little less structured. Parents are a required part of the IEP team meetings and should be a part of the 504 meetings as well. Once a child qualifies to be classified under the IDEA, again, sorry for all the alphabets, the IEP team puts together the IEP, which is a list of services, supports, modifications, and goals to be met. The 504 team meeting will determine whether the child qualifies for a 504 plan and list the accommodations the child will receive. Now, here's an interesting nuance. Again, changes from place to place. The Federal Office of Civil Rights, which is the agency that enforces 504, says that a 504 can include related services. Related services are speech, occupational therapy, physical therapy, counseling, but some districts will not provide those under a 504 plan. They will require, if your child has a speech and language problem or needs occupational therapy and you need services from a professional in that field, they will require that you seek a 504, an IEP. Sometimes, even if you've asked the school, for example, you go to the school, you say, I believe my child needs an IEP. He's struggling in math and reading. I'd like you to start the evaluation process. The school will decide for whatever reason that they don't think your child meets the criteria for an IEP because maybe his reading isn't so bad and his math is kind of close to grade level. And they can manage with some accommodations and maybe some related services. It's very frustrating as a parent. You believe your child needs the richer services of an IEP, and the school says, well, we'll give you a 504. When this happens, I generally counsel parents, don't fight it now. Say, all right, we'll try the 504, but we'll keep a careful eye on it. Your child will get some accommodations, maybe depending on where you live, some related services, and you can determine at that point, is it working? You can always, no matter what the school tells you, go back to the school and advise. You don't believe the 504 plan is sufficient. You want an IEP. If the school balks, you have the right to pursue a hearing before a state hearing officer. That's how the provisions of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and its IEP are enforced. What can you expect from a 504 plan? Well, accommodations, and they can be surprisingly broad. The clear one is extended time for testing. They'll often talk in terms of 1.5x, which means 1.5 times the standard time that students have for a test. Testing in a separate, quiet location. That can be the school library, the guidance office, or some other place where students can go First of all, so that as they take longer to complete the test, they don't get antsy because they see their classmates finishing. And secondly, so the hustle and bustle, even in a quiet classroom, won't disturb them. Some students need breaks for movement or calming. For young children, we'll sometimes suggest the accommodation of a calming corner, maybe a box of items that the student can quietly take into a private area of the room with little hand manipulatives to calm them down. Or maybe they can have a koosh ball or something at their seat. Maybe this child needs preferential seating, not just in the front of the room, but some teachers lecture or teach while walking around the room. So it depends on how that teacher functions in the classroom as to what's considered preferential seating. Keyboarding written assignments or tests using a laptop in class, that's definitely an accommodation. And in conjunction with that, learning to keyboard. It depends on the age of the child. Little ones can't keyboard. Now, this is a less important accommodation lately because everything's so digital, but we used to always recommend a separate set of books, one set for home, one set for school. The kid with an attention problem is never going to remember to bring his books home. This way, the right book is in the right place at the right time. The opportunity to front load material in a lesson. We could talk about that a little bit later, but basically preparing in advance for what's going to be taught in class that day. And there are a bunch of different ways to do that. And we'll look at those. And note-taking support. Maybe a student who takes great notes and has decent handwriting would share their notes with, obviously they'd have to be willing to do so. Maybe the teacher could provide an outline of notes so that the student can simply fill them in. There are different ways to do that. A student's notes can be copied. But whatever that is, some kids just can't take notes. Now, again, this is more relevant in a high school class than it is in a elementary class, but it's certainly something that needs to be addressed. Now, from an IEP, you're going to expect other things. First of all, an IEP, unlike a 504 plan, is very specific in its goals, in the services provided. We'll look at an IEP goal a little later. It can also include a more restrictive environment. The concept behind both laws is that students are entitled to be educated in what we call the least restrictive environment. What's the least restrictive environment? Well, for most students, it's a regular class in a regular school, being in that class full time. What's the most restrictive environment? I guess it would be a residential school, or certainly a special education school. Somewhere in the middle there is a student who's out of their regular class some of the time for a resource room or a pullout. So you're entitled to be educated in the least restrictive environment that works for you. You're entitled in an IEP to specialized instruction. In class, you may have push-in. Push-in is when a special education teacher may co-teach the class or may come in to work with this individual or a small group of students in the class. It could be a pull-out in a resource room, individually or as a group, and that affects whether the child is being educated in the least restrictive environment. It could include all the accommodations that are included in a 504 plan, and it can also include a modified curriculum. So, for example, a common one in a high school, some students with language-based learning differences really struggle with a foreign language. And that school, as do most, probably requires a student to take a certain number of years of foreign language to graduate. A student with an IEP can have a modified curriculum that exempts that student. It's called foreign language exempts that student from a foreign language. They can graduate if they're foreign language exempt without having taken the 4 years of French or Spanish or German. The problem is, and just put this sort of in the back of your mind, some colleges require that a student have a certain number of years of foreign language in order to be accepted. So if you're working with a student who has a foreign language exemption, you should be mindful of the fact that that might preclude that student from certain colleges. So don't just run for it. Sort of think before you take it. If a student needs it, that's fine. What if the IEP or 504 plan isn't working? First of all, you should be aware that both the IEP and 504 plan are required to be reviewed annually. For whatever reason, this tends to happen in spring. Spring is kind of IEP 504 season, and you have to struggle to get an appointment with the right people at your school because it's a very busy time of year. But you should know that annual review is a minimum. Parents have the right, whether it's a 504 or IEP under the IDEA, to request a new meeting at any time. You can talk about problems, you can add or delete or modify services or accommodations. How do you do this? You contact your 504 team leader or your IEP team chair. Every school calls them something slightly different, but you will know from having had your initial meeting, and you advise them that you need to look at the plan. You'd like to set up another meeting. Well, let's see if we can get to the next slide. Now, not all IEPs or 504 changes require a meeting. Some changes can be made informally by speaking to your child's teacher or teachers. For example, accommodations like where your child sits in the classroom. If he's got ants in his pants, as so many of these kids do, the opportunity to move around the room, making sure the student brings home the correct books or has the assignment. A conversation with the teacher can really help with this. Other changes can be made by the IEP or 504 team, but without a meeting, if the parents and the IEP or 504 team agree. An example, changing the frequency of speech services from 3 times to 2 times a week. Maybe the child doesn't want to be pulled out of the class and the speech is going well, and you really don't want to have her pulled from the class 3 times a week. If you're agreeable and the school is agreeable, that's just fine. Nobody has to hold a meeting, but those changes should be put in writing. Very important to understand that. What about the goals for your child? If you remember, we talked about the fact that only an IEP has specific goals. The 504 plan does not have goals. It simply states what accommodations your child is going to get. So now we're looking at the IEP. And if you want to sort of think about how these two things play out in practice, the IEP and the 504, an IEP plan, at least here in New York where I'm practicing, can have 10 pages, 15 pages. It's a very dense document. A 504 plan can be a page or 2, tops. So that sort of gives you a sense of what do these things look like? What do they have in them? Goals in an IEP should reflect the challenges that were demonstrated in your child's evaluation. Areas of difficulty should be very specifically targeted, and the way goals are measured should be specified. I pulled a set of goals for a first grader with reading difficulties out of an IEP that crossed my desk. I wouldn't say this is the most clearly written one, but a lot of them aren't clearly written. So the child has a reading problem. So the reading goal, one of several reading goals. Goal, after a shared reading of a grade level illustrated literary story, Mary will verbally retell one key detail from the beginning, middle, and end of the story with the support of visual aids, picture cards, illustrated story map from each part of the story with 80% accuracy for 2 out of 3 stories. Observations 1 time a month. It's a mouthful, and it's kind of dense, and it's not so quickly clear exactly what Mary should be learning. But if you look at it and you sort of pull it apart, you could see that Mary should be able to understand the details in the things that she's reading. And there'll be goals for math, and there'll be goals for behavior, possibly, all sorts of things. But they're very specific goals, and the goals can go on for a number of pages. So What if there is a failure to follow, not the need to make changes, but a failure to follow an IEP or a 504 plan? Let's start first in the classroom or in a related services setting. I would speak first to the teacher or the specialist involved. Make sure that they've seen the IEP or 504. This is less of an issue in elementary school when the teacher's dealing with 25 students, and can be a real issue in a high school where the teacher's got 100 students or more. Make sure that the teacher has reviewed the plan or the IEP and is familiar with its requirements. Sometimes these things just slip by the wayside. If you have an older child, by the way, that child should be familiar with the fact that he or she has an IEP or 504 plan. Your 10th grader should know that he's entitled to extended time on quizzes and tests. And if the teacher says, we're having a pop quiz today, he should raise his hand and say, I need to go to take my exam to the office, and I'll see you later. And the teacher should be aware of that, but the student should also. It's part of learning to be a self-advocate, which is a tool they will need in college and in the workplace. That's a whole nother webinar. So first of all, make sure the teacher has seen the IEP and is familiar with its requirements. Is there something going on that you're not aware of? The nature of the people who teach in schools means that there's often someone out on a maternity leave, and there's a fill-in. Is there a teacher who's not there? Is it a new teacher and you weren't aware of that, who might not know what's going on or might not be familiar with how you implement an accommodation? If you can't resolve this at the classroom level, either the teacher isn't helpful or the teacher doesn't want to be helpful, which doesn't happen often, but something is going on in the classroom. The next step is to bring your problem to the attention of the IEP or 504 team. If you recall, we spoke before about the fact that you can call a meeting at any time. This would be a time to call a meeting. You've already spoken to the teacher. You should be specific with your concerns. You should let them know you've spoken to the teacher and be clear about what you want to happen. For example, the teacher isn't providing the extended test time laid out in the 504 plan. And as we spoke about, extended time can also be provided for in an IEP because that's even broader. What if at the IEP or 504 plan level, there's a failure to follow the rules, follow the law? For IEPs, each state has an administrative system where hearing officers appointed by the state adjudicate complaints about IDEA issues, including failure to provide an appropriate IEP. Sometimes, I don't know where my voice is going today, sometimes just using what I call the magic words. I love to give families magic words. If you just tell the school that you're going to file for a hearing if they don't resolve your issue, it can get their attention and move things to a resolution. It's a pain for a parent, but it's a pain for a school to have to deal with a hearing. And it also lets them know that you're aware of your rights. It's terminology that you don't just pick up out of the air. You've spoken to somebody and they've told you to use this expression, and the school understands that. Section 504 may be enforced through the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights or through the federal court system. Now, filing for a hearing under the IDEA or the Department of Education, certainly filing a federal lawsuit requires an attorney. There are lots of ways to find attorneys who represent families. They're usually not primarily interested in making a fortune. These are people who tend to care about children. One resource for this is the website of the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, COPA, COPAA.org, has a find an attorney feature. Or your local bar association, or some districts have not just a PTA, but a special education PTA. Sometimes they're called SEPTAs, special education PTA. Some of the parents in that group might people they can recommend to help you. Some people use advocates, some people use attorneys, but under the IDEA, you can bring anybody you want to a meeting. So you may just want somebody to help you through this process. So let's slowly go through the takeaways. First of all, we've looked at the fact that we are dealing with two different laws that have different points of origin, Section 504 and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. They are different in how they're applied, although there's definitely overlap. The IEP from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is for all qualifying students, and it applies both in public and private schools, and includes private schools that take federal money. Section 504 covers a long list of disabilities. It's a very long list. It's not generally available in private schools. And the two laws aren't mutually exclusive. Some students might want to try a 504 plan first. And the reason, by the way, that districts sometimes balk, it's kind of an awkward thing. The IDEA gives funding to states. Each state gets funding. The states pass along the funding to their districts. When you get funding from the federal government, you have to be responsive to the federal government and tell them what's going on. So states have a reporting requirement. And so a district will report to the state that they have these many children classified under the IDEA, and perhaps the state would want it broken down by the ethnicity or the racial makeup. They want to make sure too many children of one background or another aren't simply being foisted into the IEP system rather than being dealt with more individually. So there is a reporting requirement under the IDEA that does not exist under Section 504. Some states pass along the sense to their districts that they don't want too many IEPs. They don't want too many kids classified. And so there sometimes, and this is less so lately, but it certainly used to be an issue, some pushback on, well, we don't want to necessarily classify too many kids. Take a 504 plan and see if it works. And usually that's not an unreasonable, their reasoning isn't reasonable, but trying a 504 plan may not be the worst thing. But remember, don't let too much time go by. Take a few months, see if it's helping. If it's not, move fairly quickly to seek an IEP under the IDEA. Even my tongue gets tied in these things. So an IEP is best if your student needs real academic support, services from speech and language, physical therapy, occupational therapy, or counseling. That's generally the law to seek out. And in both laws, you're going to start with your evaluation process. Only the IEP has specific goals and ways to measure if they're met. And looking at the child's progress in meeting these goals is how you tell if an IEP is working. 504 is generally sufficient if the student simply needs accommodations. Both laws require annual updates. You'll get a letter from the school. It's time for your annual IEP meeting or your 504 meeting. But there's no need for you as a parent to wait for that meeting to raise issues. And we've talked about how to sort of start the inquiry process if things aren't going well with the teacher and then with the IEP team. Both laws, as we spoke about, require an evaluation. The rules for an evaluation under an IEP IDEA are more extensive, but in some places they will be identical. The district would just apply the rules that apply for the IEP to a 504 plan. There are different ways to get evaluations, but the cheapest and sometimes quite appropriate and adequate is through the school district. Only if you don't feel that the school district will do a good job, or that it's been shown that they don't do a good job, the parents need to look elsewhere for an evaluation. It's important to remember, I think we just spoke about that you can start with one approach, but don't hesitate to move to the other. So you would really be moving up. It's rare that you go from an IEP to just a 504. It happens. Students' academic issues are no longer major, and the student simply needs accommodations. And if you're not getting for your child what you believe your child needs, there are paths to follow. There are legal remedies. Some of them are more complex than others. It's never fun to go to war with your school. But if you look at it as you need to do what your child has to have, need to fight for what your child has to have, that's what's important. And you as the parent can take on that role and be a successful advocate for your own child if you understand the two basic ways to get help, what each gives you and doesn't give you, and how you can move on from that. And that's it, folks. Are there any questions?
My apologies, switching to the other screen. Susan, thank you so much for that overview. Lots of information to take in and lots of questions to ask. So I will get right to them. I just want to briefly, again, thank our sponsor, Brain Balance, for sponsoring this webinar. One thing definitely clear in the questions is that every individual circumstance is unique. Of course, every child is unique. Could you offer some general resources for parents or caregivers or educators who are just looking for more support in general on their individual path? Any resources that you would recommend?
Well, I think that we sort of have to break that down a little bit. To get a better understanding of how these laws work, what kids can need in different circumstances, there are a few really good places to start. I would go to the website for Understood. That's understood, one word, .org. They are a pretty sound resource with a lot of Q&As for different issues, and they help guide you through the process of understanding different learning disabilities and how to get the kind of help you need. That's one place. If you have specific legal questions, one resource is the website maintained by Peter Wright, which is Wright's Law, WRIGHTSLAW, Wright's Law. I think it's a .com, but I wouldn't swear to it. You might have to look in a search engine. And that has a ton of information, probably more than you'll ever want, about 504 and IEP and IDEA. And it'll give you everything from the text of the court cases to how a parent can pursue certain issues in school. It's a very, very rich site. Getting into where you need to go isn't always that clear, but I would highly recommend it. It's been around for a long time. Pete Wright and is a lawyer. I think his wife is a social worker, psychologist, but they dealt with this issue for a very long time. Another resource for parents is the National Center for Learning Disabilities, ncld.org. And then there might be something you've heard of. If you've gotten this far, you might find that Attitude, which, as we all know, focuses on ADHD, really also has a lot of stuff on learning. And there are search features that you can use for Attitude magazine. My office has a blog we've written, something I was just counting with like 11 or 1,200 different topical articles on some of these things. How do you get funding for a school? What's the difference between this and that? I'm not going to give you the site. That's self-advertising. You have my name. You can figure out where it is by going to a search engine and just look for our office blog. Those are some real basic ones that come off the top of my head.
Very helpful. We will be sure to include all of those links in the resources section of the webinar replay page. So for those of you who are listening, we'll make those easy links for you. I have a couple of brass tacks questions that are coming up an awful lot. So I think they'll be pretty easy to get through. A lot of questions regarding whether charter schools would fall under the public or private domain.
Charter schools are public schools.
Right. So you are
so they
legally
follow
entitled.
the rules for a public school.
Perfect.
Now, not
Okay.
all charter schools are as welcoming for children with certain disabilities and issues. But by law, they are public schools. They have to follow the public schools arrangement. Some of them have a philosophy that makes it a less comfortable place, but that's very individual.
Okay. Also hearing from parents who are stuck at step number 1. They have requested an evaluation from their public school and the school has denied it. What can they do?
That's a problem. And the reason it's a problem is if the school did a terrible evaluation, you have certain rights. You have the right to have the school pay for a private evaluation. But the right to get an evaluation, if the school simply declines. Now, they could decline for 2 reasons, and I'm going to give you the broad view first and then focus on a more specific case. If a school declines to evaluate your child, the only real remedy you have is to seek a hearing before a state hearing officer to order the district to conduct an evaluation. It's unfortunate, but that's one area where there's sort of a gap in what the law should be providing. There are 2 other issues. One, if the school has done a lousy evaluation and you object to that evaluation and you advise the school that you wish to seek a private evaluation and you want them to pay for it, they either have to pay for it or file for a hearing to explain before a hearing officer why they shouldn't have to pay for it. Usually, by the way, they have to pay for it. So that's situation 2. And finally, there are states. Because I'm here in New York, we encounter families from New Jersey. New Jersey, as an example, is a state that puts an extra step in the process. And the way that works is that the school will have a school-based team that will determine whether the child is entitled to an evaluation. I hate it. That's the first thing I ask when somebody says, well, could you talk to this family? I'll say, where are they from? And when they tell me New Jersey, I'll say, oh, that's not really what I want to do. And it's very frustrating for parents because the school acts as a gatekeeper. They determine whether or not that child is entitled to an evaluation. But parents at any point in time have the right to seek a hearing. Now, it's not like you file a piece of paper and you get before a hearing officer the next week. It's a cumbersome process, and that's a problem. So none of this stuff, some of this stuff can really get you bogged down for a while. It's not easy and it's not always ideal, but that's the law.
Along these same lines, hearing parents who are stuck at step 2. So they've gotten the evaluation, and the school says, okay, your child has ADHD, but look, their grades are fine. So we don't think they are entitled to even a 504 plan, much less an IEP. Parents, we know that our children can do better, and they deserve all the help that they.
Okay, but now entitled. 2 things here. One is let's break it down. First of all, if their child is struggling academically and really needs academic support, even though the school says they don't, remember that the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, does not require that the school provide perfect or excellent education, only appropriate, which, as we talked about before, is a relatively low level. So if the school says, well, Johnny's getting B pluses, and even though you think he could get an A plus if he got services or supports, that's not our job. That's not our problem. That's sort of answer number one. Number two is if they don't, just because a child is doing well doesn't mean that they don't have a disability and doesn't mean that they couldn't do better with accommodations. You might want to try the 504 plans. Tell them, look, I understand you're balking and maybe you don't want to give him an IEP, although I disagree with you and I think you're wrong, but let's not fight about that now. Why don't you let's give him some extended time and some extra, better place to sit in the classroom and have the teacher work with him to make sure he's getting his assignments right. Those are all 504 accommodations. Sometimes that's sufficient. I would at least start with that. If you have an evaluation that shows a true disability and the evaluator will say the diagnosis is dyslexia or the diagnosis is a reading disorder or a math disorder, and your evaluation should have that in it, and the district declines to provide services to remediate that, then that would be the basis for filing for a hearing.
Okay. A lot of parents here are saying that their child's primary challenge is executive function.
Yes, I have one of those at home.
As we know, ADHD is an executive function disorder. So,
right.
Well, is that appropriate to address? And if so, do you have some recommendations?
Yes, it's very appropriate to address. It's almost like a threshold. If you can't function with the executive functions, you're not going to be able to do anything else. The schools don't recognize executive function as a diagnosis. What they will look at is an attention deficit disorder, which is sort of adjacent to executive function. The ability to function in an efficient way often relates to attention. There are all sorts of ways to resolve that. We will sometimes ask to have put into an IEP that the student have an executive function coach. There are actually such things, and these are people who teach kids organizational skills. Special educators can also work with students to get these executive functions in play. There are all sorts of ways to work with kids to help them be more organized. I'm probably the last person. I'm looking around at my desk, I probably shouldn't be speaking to this right now. But yeah, first of all, understand that a school will not take a diagnosis of an executive function disorder. It didn't even exist 10 years ago. Nobody talked about it. It's a fairly new thing. The schools really will look at it through the eyes of attention deficit. What you need to do is look at how does it impact the student? What are the day-to-day issues that arise from that? So you need to break it down. The student doesn't bring home his work. The student doesn't copy down his assignments. The student loses his papers. There are steps that you can go through to make each of these things better. And it could certainly be in an IEP and can be part of a 504 plan. But in order to get the school to sort of buy into it, I would put it in the realm of an attention or concentration deficit and try to get their cooperation through that lens.
Okay, interesting. Obviously, a lot of questions coming in from parents of middle schoolers on that one. What I'm seeing more commonly among elementary students is the emotional dysregulation of ADHD and how that can cause behavior problems. And how, I guess, one question is, are we better off pursuing a behavior intervention plan, or can behavior be addressed in a 504 plan?
I don't really see behavior being addressed in a 504 plan directly. Things like we were talking earlier about going to a quiet corner of the classroom. We sometimes talk about a student having a box And in the box are several different things that the student can pull out and play with quietly. If the student needs to calm themselves, they can have something at their desk. These are all things that shouldn't disturb other students, shouldn't bring attention to the student with the issue. You don't want a kid to be, pointed out or bullied, heaven forbid, by his classmates. But small things, quiet things, minimal things to help calm the student down. But a significant set of behavior problems really can only be addressed through an IEP, and that behavioral intervention program or plan is part of an IEP. And that would require an evaluation of behaviors, a plan to address them, but that is beyond the scope of a 504 plan. But there are things you can do, smaller things. For example, a kid who's unable to stay focused and quiet for a while and just sort of bubbles over after a certain amount of time in the classroom, maybe you can make that kid the class messenger and come up with a reason for that child to take a note down to the office. And by going through the hallways and blowing off some steam and going up 2 flights of stairs and down 2 flights of stairs, by the time he returns to the classroom, a little bit of that energy is spent and he's less likely to cause trouble or get into trouble. I mean, there are all kinds of things you can do that are sort of practical interventions like that.
Mm-hmm. And for those more serious behavior problems, that is a webinar.
That's an IEP issue.
Yeah, we have, we'll include this in the resources section as well. We have had a whole webinar just on behavior intervention plans. So we'll be sure to include that link, since that is a question that's come up quite a bit. And this, as if this process weren't complicated enough, of course, we have COVID on top of it all. And I'm hearing...
I'm shaking my head here.
I know. But I'm hearing a lot from parents here who are saying that the schools are having real resource constraints, and that the resources, whether it's a speech and language or occupational therapy, is just not available at the school, and their children are not receiving services. So what can they do?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, hopefully this issue will resolve over time. It's national in scope. There are mechanisms, and I've got to be honest, I don't know the details of them, where districts can fund private people. Of course, there's a shortage of private people as well. So that's an issue. But the fact that the district doesn't have a speech and language person available technically is not an excuse for not providing it. So one aspect might be for the district to privately fund if you can find one privately. And that would be, I would say that's got to be part of an IEP process. More than that, I can't help with, because it really is a problem. It really is a problem.
Right. Yes. It's, what a time to be alive. I'm hoping we can squeeze in, these are 2 related questions regarding self-advocacy. You mentioned the importance of teaching that skill. And so one question from younger children who are learning in the beginning stages of learning to speak up for themselves, can it be included in a 504 plan that the teacher proactively offer the accommodations so that it's not resting on the child's shoulders?
Oh, it should be it definitely should be. The teacher should know that Johnny gets to take his tests in the library, for example. So the teacher should say to Johnny, "Oh, Johnny, we're about to sit for our history test. Go see Miss Smith in the library. Here's your test. It's in a sealed envelope," let's say. Johnny takes the test to the library. Miss Smith knows that there was going to be a test. She puts him in a quiet corner and sets a timer. But not every teacher is going to do that. They forget. They haven't read the 504 plan. They're having a bad day, whatever. Johnny should be mindful of the fact that he's supposed to take his test in the library. So he puts his hand up and says, "Excuse me, teacher, I'm supposed to go to the library and take my test there?" "Yes, you're right. Thank you for reminding me." That's all. Mm-hmm. That's elementary school level self-advocacy.
Okay. And the follow-up to that is a lot of parents wondering when it is appropriate and helpful for their child to participate in 504 or IEP meetings.
As soon, depending on their difficulties, as soon as they can understand what's going on and be comfortable. Ideally, I would say by late elementary school, certainly middle school, not necessarily for the whole meeting. They don't need to, understand every aspect of their plan or program. But if they are comfortable, they should certainly come in the beginning and get a sense of it. Maybe at the end, you call them in. This is the meeting. Look, all these people here, we're trying to figure out. We're talking about your math class. What's working for you in your math class? What are you having a problem with? It really depends on the maturity of the child, but it certainly doesn't have to be the entire meeting. And it's certainly, certain sensitive things shouldn't be discussed in front of a young child. By high school, they've got to be there. They're going to be on their own. They're going to be in college.
Right. And I will just repeat this point that you made earlier, that you can call a meeting at any time.
Yes, absolutely. You don't get it the next day, but you have the right to a meeting. And there are steps, as I said, you can take without a meeting. But just because it's once a year, and don't let the school tell you otherwise, you have the right to an IEP meeting.
Right. I felt like that was an important point to restate here. Unfortunately, we are out of time. There are hundreds more questions. We could have a series of these and never get to them all.
Because I have nothing else to do.
No, that was incredibly helpful. I have a notebook full of notes, as I'm sure everyone else does. So thank you so much, Susan, for
You're very welcome.
This.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure.
And thank you to the Attitude audience for joining us today. And to make sure you don't miss any future Attitude webinars or other great content, sign up for our free newsletters at attitudemag.com/newsletters. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 391 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the certificate of attendance option. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.